All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the War Room series, courtesy of YouTube. First and foremost, me and my co hosts would just like to give a shout out to our subscribers. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate the love and support. Hope you ladies and gents are doing well this evening or morning time, wherever you are across this world. I definitely look forward to this particular episode of the War Room series that we're going to be getting into later tonight. But before we get started, let me go ahead and introduce one of my favorite co-hosts for the War Room series, the man from Germany himself. He goes by Logic's Finest, and honestly, the man is too smart for his own good. But I enjoy him as much as anybody. So, Mr. Logic Finest, glad to have you here on the show today. How you doing?
I have no idea who you even talking about, but me myself, it's always a pleasure to be here, sir.
Likewise, likewise. Well, hope you're doing well over there in Germany. I'm pretty sure there's a lot going on that side of the world, especially in the middle of Europe, as Germany is certainly one of the hubbubs of that particular region. Um, a lot of great things going on over there, as I've been hearing lately.
Um, yeah, it's very interesting, and you know, before I even speak on that, I
Hmm.
really just wanted to take a few minutes to speak on something.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Before we get started tonight, I just want to really, speak about culture and mindset and how those two are inextricably linked. So, all of us, we are absolutely a product of our environment. So, around the world, there are many varying types of cultures. So, in some cultures, family is stressed more than anything else. Okay, so the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. There are some cultures where it's all about the father. The father lays down the rules, he lays down the directions for your life. He will basically plot out your life and where you will go in it. Now, Adolf and Joseph both came from those types of cultures. Every culture has values, and some cultures put higher importance upon other things as opposed to other cultures. In some cultures, in some cultures, image is more important than anything else. And your culture, that where you come from, it shapes your mindset. And the collective mindset, in turn, shapes that culture. So it becomes a closed loop that constantly reinforces itself. One creates the other, which creates the other, which creates the other. Case in point, even though I've said this 1,000 times in many different places, I was born and raised in the Northeast. I am not a foreigner. One of my parents is. I am not. So we tend in the Northeast to look upon the South, no disrespect, but we always looked at it as slow, um, not as sharp on certain things. Whether this is an accurate description or not is beside the point. The point here is that's the culture in the Northeast, and that shapes our mindsets. And our mindsets continued that culture. So I say all that to say this. For any person who is listening now, any person who may be listening to this on a replay, if you are coming to this particular stream that we co host, and if your culture or of your mindset is looking for a particular perspective based on anything other than pure objective observation, you've come to the absolute wrong place. So, with that being said, I'm absolutely looking forward to see how the men that we have covered, the culture and the mindset that they came from, how that in turn shaped their mindset, which led them to create the culture that they created when they became world leaders. And in many respects, they can largely continued the majority of the culture and the mindset which they came from, which they in turn perpetuated. So let's jump right in.
Absolutely, and I couldn't have said it better myself. That's one thing with this particular platform and the other platform that I host, that is very big on culture. Is something that is thoroughly overlooked. And despite what could, how others may interpret your culture and everything, the thing to keep in mind, and we also stress this too here on the War Room series, is being able to look upon life from a objective point of view. Not being not having your emotions tied in to where you've only see things from one sided and you don't understand other people's cultural aspects. To me, that's where a lot of people, both men and women, fall short because they have this pre notion of what people in other areas are. And don't get me wrong, there's a reason why stereotypes exist for that particular reason. But at the same time, you won't know exactly what that culture is like 100% unless you go there, you travel there, and objectively go in there to learn what that culture is all about. And so, as there's one thing I want the readers to kind of understand and make sure that when we talk about these individuals, you know, how they grew up and how they saw society, the portion of culture that they came through also played a historical role in who they became later on down the road. Now,
Absolutely.
could you have switched places between those leaders and special individuals? Absolutely. The running joke right now on our series is you can replace either one of these individuals and some form of fashion, their character will still remain the same. but but at the same time, culture does plays a factor. There's a reason why Churchill came from a well-to-do family compared to, say, Hitler or Mussolini, and likewise, the things that Stalin has experienced during his time growing up is going to be vastly different compared to what Mussolini, Hitler, and even tonight, uh, Franklin D. Roosevelt has experienced. So again, culture is definitely something that plays a major factor. And to me, a person will not be able to fully experience what those cultures are until they go there and they let their five senses experience it all. You don't have to like get fully enthralled in it, but if you allow your senses to truly become one with that environment, you get a pretty good understanding of why the people thought the way they thought, why they believe in certain beliefs and everything. And then from there, you'll be able to come to your understanding of whether that culture is for you or not. And the beauty about this whole world is there's a culture for everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you are an individual and if you're coming from a specific culture and you're coming from a specific mindset, if you're there's an old saying, closed minds can't open doors. So if you are unable to understand the perspective and mindset of a different culture, then you have closed yourself off to the wider experiences of the world that we live in. See, it's easy to stay inside of a box. Whatever your box is, whatever your box is, it's simple, it's easy, and it's safe. And inherently, most people prefer that safety. Okay, the difference is you have to have the courage to step outside of that box, to remove yourself from that comfort zone and explore other cultures. Now, there is another fear that goes out there that will tell you if you experience a different culture or a different perspective, you are being assimilated. Those are two very separate and different things. And ultimately, that statement comes from a position of fear of engaging and understanding different cultures, different perspectives, and different mindsets. And even though I'm somewhat loath to use the example, but on the flip side, he's actually a person who I find a great amount of irony in that people love to pick up to use the name of Malcolm X, and they love to talk about
Mm-hmm.
his criminal past, and they love to talk about his firebrand days when he was in the Nation of Islam. But none of those same people mention when he returned from his trip to Mecca. Because when he came back from Mecca, he said, I've seen other cultures. I've
Mm-hmm.
engaged people from around the world. I've sat down and I broke bread with them and spoke to them and understand their mindsets and they understand mine. And my eyes are now open. And all of that division that I spoke when I was with the Nation of Islam, I will never speak that again. Because at the end of the day, we're all one race, human. So I will devote the rest of my life working to unite peoples of different religions, ethnicities, skin colors, and nationalities as one. So we can collectively put our focus toward the elite few who control us all through divide and conquer. But see, no one wants to talk about that. That Malcolm opened his eyes when he experienced other cultures and mindsets. The two are inextricably linked. So, again, um, for those listening off air, Brother Sigmund Jones and I both said we're still going to hit we're we're going to pull our punches, but we're going to be hitting a lot harder intellectually because too many of too much of a certain element keeps attempting to creep in and assert itself here, and that cannot be allowed. And that's all I have to say about that.
Indeed, indeed, and 100% on that as well. Well, before we get started, definitely want to shout out the ones that's definitely in the chat right now. Isaac Sama, glad to see you, sir. Big Task at Hand, good to see you. Wadner, good to see you as well. JJ Wilson and Saying God, good to see you as well. And also just want to salute Isaac Sama for the first ever War Room Cash App that donated to the stream tonight, and definitely want to thank you for that, good sir. We definitely appreciate any donations that come through. For those who enjoy the content and all, feel free to donate. Definitely do so. If not, we just glad that you're able to watch the streams and all. So we definitely appreciate any kind of contributions to the show and the platform. Now, with that said, so tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about the 32nd president of the United States of America, the one who was nicknamed the Houdini of the White House, and that's none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I find it interesting that I'm just going to come out and say it. A lot of the things that we're going to see politically from Franklin D. Roosevelt's days leading up to his eventual presidency in the United States is almost like watching a replay of the things that happened back then in America that is currently happening right now. And this is why I love doing history, because history, without a shadow of a doubt, if you don't learn from it, you're doomed to repeat it. And that is exactly what is going on in this day and age.
Absolutely. People don't study history and they don't listen. They don't listen, they don't study history, they don't understand a few snapshots here and there, a quick 30-second Google search, and people think they're informed when they are not. So, as the old saying goes, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them.
Exactly. And so, before we get started, shout out to Lawrence Guy. Shalom to you, sir. But exactly as you pointed out, the and actually, when we get into a little bit of the chapter where we start talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt, what I like about this book, the book is also pinned to the chat room. It's called Franklin D. Roosevelt Powers and Profile by Patrick Renshaw. It's a very interesting biography that Renshaw did on Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the biography was also approved by the Roosevelt family. So, whatever you're reading in this book, as well as what you're going to hear from within the stream and the next streams coming up talking about Roosevelt, these are historical facts about Franklin D. Roosevelt and the people that were around him at the time. And so a lot of intricacies about Franklin D. Roosevelt that there's definitely a lot of sides to him that the public doesn't know too much about. And in my honest opinion, there's a reason there's a lot of side to him that the public doesn't know about. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Finest?
I couldn't agree more because, you know, first of all, again, it was a different time. It was a different age. The country was still, you know, we're talking actually the late 80s and then the early 1900s, the First World War, the years after the war, the years leading up to the stock market crash and the eventual Great Depression. So the world was a much different place. So it was people could have been more tolerant of all of the sides to FDR, but people most certainly did not know. And to a large extent, people did not really want to know. People wanted to, and it's funny, as you said, what happened decades ago is repeating itself. It repeats itself over and over in a never-ending cycle. People don't want to know the full truth about anything. They only want to hear the comfortable sound bites. So we're about to jump right in. If we get to it tonight, I really want people to pay attention to the Supreme Court and how that's going to come up during the presidency of FDR, because there's a point that I'm really going to hammer home when we get there.
Likewise, and I'm definitely looking forward to that topic too as well. So, the early parts of Franklin D. Roosevelt that we're going to cover is actually in two chapters. And so, we're going to cover chapter 2 in this stream, and then following the next stream coming up next month, we'll cover the next chapter leading up to the 1920s when Roosevelt is definitely getting more and more into his political side, as well as like my co-host just mentioned, a lot of the political information going on, especially during the Supreme Court case. We really want the audience to hone in on that information because it's really some details that most of the public do not even know about it unless you truly put your nose in a book and find out the facts. And so, like my co-host said, I can't wait till we get to that topic because there's definitely something that we're going to try to hammer home on that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So this is chapter 2 titled The Power of Patrician Upbringing from 1882 to 1911. It starts off by saying Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a key figure in the critical years of the 20th century who acted on the world stage with Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill. In what was popularly called the American Century, or the Century of the Common Man, FDR became champion of the common people, not just of America, but the world. Yet not the least of the many paradoxes about his life was that, from the very start, aristocratic birth set him apart from the American people he came to lead. The political power he won and used with such zest and effect must be first examined within this context. Roosevelt is a Dutch name. The first Europeans to settle in New York were fur traders from Holland. In 1624, they established a small community on Manhattan Island, which, until 1664, remained a Dutch colony. With little or no backing from Holland, the small province of New Netherlands grew slowly, failing to establish the effective self-government that other colonies, planted by English settlers, were able to evolve. But it did leave a permanent mark in the patroon system of plantations, which grew along the Hudson River, and in the Knickerbocker families, who were to play an important role in the history of New York and United States. So it's interesting here that the first two paragraphs kind of talks about how the many paradoxes of FDR, how the man is considered the champion of the common people, yet his background, which we're going to read through later on, was anything but the common man. You could say the Franklin D. Roosevelt would not know what it's like to come from a middle class family, let alone a poor class family. And even then, when you read up on the history of the Roosevelts in the United States, as you can see, they slowly start to establish themselves in one of the mecca centers of the time, which was to become New York City.
FDR came from money. It's the bottom line. Where he's from, Hyde Park, which we consider upstate New York, along Hudson Valley, in the Hudson River Valley. He came from money. When he was born on an estate. Working class people don't have an estate.
No.
The man came from money. He was born into money, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely, but he was by no means a common man. The family had homes, okay? Homes. So he was raised on the estate, and they would vacation at two or three different homes. So he was not a common man. He was not a working class man. He came from money. He came from what's called culture and breeding. Again, returning back to my earlier statement about culture and mindset, how the two are inextricably linked. So,
Indeed. And in fact, the next paragraph actually ties in a little bit more of what you're talking about, Mr. Finest. And it says Roosevelt was born into such a family of landed aristocrats on the 30th of January, 1882. His father, James, was not simply a millionaire. He was one of the proudest and oldest names in the land. More important, he represented old money. His mother, Sarah Delano, came from another old established family. The Roosevelts had made their fortune from land and trading in the 18th century and increased their wealth during the 19th century. James owned copper lands, iron, and coal mines, anchorage on New York Harbor, and a fleet of clipper ships. But managers ran his business for him so he could enjoy his country's estates and, like his father, dabble in Democratic Party politics. So again, like we see here, almost similar to Churchill, but definitely not from a royal aristocratic line as Churchill came from, but nevertheless, Franklin born into a well-to-do family, his father pretty much a well-respected name in New York. As we just saw, he owned pretty much a lot of precious metals and mines that dug up those metals, owned a fleet of ships within the New York harbor, and essentially just hired people to run his business for him while he just enjoyed the, as they say, the good life, and rightfully so.
you know, it's funny because the history of New York City, even the people who were born and raised and lived their entire lives, they hear the names and they don't understand the true history of New York City and its Dutch roots. So the Bronx family owned
Mm-hmm.
a large swath of land, which is now one of the five boroughs of New York City. The Bronx was named after the Bronx family. The Brooklyn family, this large swath of land is named after that family, Brooklyn. So from Roosevelt, as we now know, and the the names Holland and Skemmerhorn, so many so many names throughout all the five boroughs of New York City. The history of New York City, Van Wyck. This I can go on and on and on and on, but the point here is that this family is one of those old established families that are the founding history of New York City.
Indeed, indeed, and I'm glad you kind of touch up on that because now that kind of gives a better understanding, at least for me, that this was how life was for Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. You literally was living within an empire where your family is essentially part of the history of New York. So it's one thing if you come from a family line where they done their work and everything and developed their wealth over time. Literally, like you pointed out, the Bronx, the Brooklyns, and even the Roosevelts, their family name is literally tied to the buildup and establishment of New York City as a metropolitan.
And there's one last thing that I really have to hammer home, and it's that word that's thrown around by so many people about privilege. Look, allow me to explain something to you. The only privilege in life is money and the access it grants you. Anything else is hot air. We can absolutely have an intelligent debate about that from now until the cows come home. The only privilege in life is money and the access that it grants you. So here you are seeing another person who eventually became to be a head of state who comes from a family that had money, access, and power. Because that's where it comes from. Power. Political power comes from what? Money. If you don't have money, you have no political power. The only privilege in life is money and the access that it grants you.
Indeed, indeed. And shout out to Ashley, man. Good to see you, sir. So to finish up, the next paragraph says Franklin Roosevelt grew up keenly aware of the tradition which he had inherited. In a student history thesis on the Roosevelts in New Amsterdam, he explained some of the famous Dutch families in New York today have nothing left but their name. They are few in numbers, they lack progressivism, and a true democratic spirit. One reason, perhaps the chief, of the virility of the Roosevelts is their very democratic spirit. They have felt that there was no excuse for them if they did not do their duty by the community. As a political friend told him when he ran for national office in 1920, we want gentlemen to represent us. Frankness and largeness and simplicity and a fine fervor for the right are virtues that some must preserve. And where can one look for them if not from the Roosevelts and the Delanos? This sense of noblesse oblige was one reason Roosevelt entered politics. He believed it the duty of progressive reformers to seek power and tame corporate interests, which, as he grew up in the 1880s and the 1890s, were challenging established landed families like the Roosevelts. So interesting here that we kind of see a little bit of why Roosevelt got into politics, but I honestly believe that, as you pointed out, Mr. Finest, Logic's Finest, that when you have when when you have power through finances, that's when you also have power through politics. Because in order to be involved in politics, you got to have some sort of finances to back it up. And I find it really strange how most people today who get involved in politics truly forget just that small little detail that you need money in order to make things happen.
No, I don't necessarily think that most people who get involved in politics don't understand that you need money to make things happen. I think that certain groups and a certain demographic of people fail to understand that you need money in politics to make things happen. You know, again, The only the only privilege in life is money and the access that it grants you. Without money, you have no political power.
Mm-hmm.
One does not follow without the other. So again, we're seeing here, noticing in the last paragraph that you just read, it comes back again to my opening statement, how culture and mindset are a self-perpetuating cycle. One follows the other, one creates the other. So you see how the culture that FDR was raised in, what he was exposed to, how that shaped his mindset, and how that shaped would eventually shape and form the basis of his worldview. So again, this is why you hear certain people always harp on it's all about culture. That's what's important. If you want to understand the basis of things, it comes down to the culture. So
Indeed. Indeed. Next section, it starts off by saying, but for the moment, such power struggles left no apparent trace on Frank's charmed world. When he was born, his father, James, was 53, his first wife having died in 1876. James then married Sarah Delano in 1880 when she was 26, the same age as James' son by his first marriage. So while Frank's father treated him like a grandson, Sarah lavished quite remarkable, yet possessive, love on her only child. He was brought up on the beautiful Hyde Park estate with indulgence unusual even for his social class. He had governess and tutors. He owned a pony and a 21-foot sailboat. He toured Europe 8 times before his adolescence. His childhood was idyllic but lonely. He did not go to school until he was 16, when he became a boarder at Groton, where the headmaster, Endicott Peabody, mixed the lessons of Greek democracy with Christian ethics. Further, between the ages of 10 and 18, Frank's conduct was constrained by the fact that his father became an invalid after a stroke. Throughout the crucial years of adolescence, rebellion against parents, a key part of normal teenage development, was not part of his. This desire to please, especially to please his loving mother, hint hint, and not to be seen doing anything which might upset people, became an important part of Roosevelt's personality in adolescence and adult life. Moreover, it is not without significance that, throughout his life, a common description of Roosevelt's eager, happy demeanor was that it was boyish. Now, I hope the audience caught that within those 2 paragraphs. The fact that, his father pretty much treated him like a grandson, being that he was very much older in age. And of course, you have the mother who was very devoting and always looking after her precious little boy to make sure that, so to speak, he didn't get too much into trouble. And I, again, I'm reading that, I'm thinking, didn't we just cover this with Churchill and his upbringing as well?
and Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler.
And Hitler.
Every
Yep.
single one. Same exact thing. Whether they were dirt poor as Hitler was, or they came from money as Churchill and FDR did. But what was also of interest to me, or what rather should be of interest to those listening, people who come from money, they send their children around the world to engage in what? Other cultures, other
Mm-hmm.
perspectives. When you stay in your little box, your mindset is little. And your view of the world is from you're inside of a tiny little box looking out through a peephole at the world. So how can you possibly form and frame an informed mindset when you've been trapped inside this little small box? So, for those who are unawares, okay, those who are born to privilege, and that meaning money, not ethnicity, not skin color, not religion, money and the access that it grants you, travel and exposure to other cultures, mindsets.
Exactly. And the thing is this, one thing I want to also point out to the audience is that this is why when you start to develop your wealth and you develop it over time to where you're pretty much you're pretty much in a different class altogether. I'm You would still be classified as part of, the upper class and whatnot, but still in a different class. The problems that face the poor and even the middle class is not something that boggles people who have developed wealth over time. And this is why I preach that the elites only practice classism. Everybody else practice all of the isms that's out there in the world. Very big difference. Alrighty. And salute to Ace. Good to see you, sir. The next two paragraphs says, all this seems to have played a part in making him lonely and unhappy at Groton. His peers devalued a fellow pupil so determined to please his elders. Moreover, the long years he had spent alone, growing up at Hyde Park, had not prepared him for the rough and tumble of school, the playing fields, and dormitory. He was not used to being ragged, made fun of, challenged to fight like most schoolboys. Worse, he had started at Groton 2 years after the rest of his class, when everyone else had made their friends. At this stage of his life, he was an outsider, and he made no close contacts at Groton. Moreover, sport played an important part in the life of the school, and young Roosevelt was not good at games. He grew into a big, strong, handsome man who enjoyed the physical side of life and was a good yachtsman, swimmer, and outdoor person. But he never made a mark at team games. Quote, I never could understand all this fuss about Frank, Groton's captain of baseball, Jeffrey Potter, wrote when his friend's former schoolmate became president in March 1933. He never amounted to anything much at school. One biographer, Arthur Schlesinger, argues that too much can be made of his failure at Groton. It contrasts with so much success everywhere else in his life. But as his wife Eleanor wrote 50 years later, he felt left out. It gave him sympathy for people who are left out. Whatever the truth of the matter, he himself knew at the time that something had gone wrong and vowed that it would not happen again when he went to Harvard in 1900. So, interesting, we see here that you could say when you look at the likes of Hitler and Mussolini and even Stalin, these three individuals, for the most part, definitely started to understand social dynamics from a young age. And what I mean by that is interacting with peers and interacting with other uh, children around their age and everything. And so, despite the fact that, you have the likes of Hitler, who felt like he needed to be the leader of everything, and you got Mussolini, that we read had a tendency to want to stab people and get into fights and whatnot. We see here with Roosevelt that because he had a late start as far as starting to interact with peers and whatnot, it was very hard for him to relate to his peers and being able to kind of catch on to the social dynamics, which to me I find interesting that this same individual, like the captain of the school just said, the baseball team, this individual will go on to become the president of the United States.
Yeah, it's fun. See, that's rather funny because it's actually quite typical of you'll find students who either go away who are raised at boarding schools and raised by nannies, as you see a lot of the especially the European royal families and even the European aristocracy. So not so much the royal family, but the aristocracy. Their children who were raised at boarding schools and raised by nannies, they have not much of a relationship with their parents. So
Mm-hmm.
they themselves end up being rather cold people because they never got those those truly meaningful developmental relationships from an early age. So I find it interesting that FDR and his father clearly, they were raised in similar manners. So, you know, again, it's funny how, as the old saying goes, we're all a product of our environment.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Indeed. And to me, that's where definitely this highlights environment playing an important role. Because I would ask myself, especially after reading a little bit of this tidbit, if you was to take out uh, Franklin Roosevelt
Mhm.
and replace him with, say, Hitler, and Hitler still got the devoted type of love from his mother, but instead of having a father who was abusive, you kind of had a father who was just not engaging. As I said, treating him like a
Right,
grandfather. We
exactly.
know grandfathers, they're just kind of ones where they acknowledge your existence, but they're not too much engaging. And, we can debate as far as why all that come about. But it's just similar to like, if Hitler was growing up in how Roosevelt grew up, how differently would his maturity would have been growing up in that type of environment? That's kind of a question I kind of ask myself. If we was to take some of these characters we have covered so far in their early years, switch them to their respective leaders in their environments, and how much would their environment may have played a role in changing how they
Right,
view society?
right, exactly. Because having a emotionally and physically abusive father in the home is just as detrimental as having no father in the home, clearly. So this comes back to another theme that you're seeing repeated at this very moment: lack of a father in the home, or a father who's in the home who is physically and or emotionally abusive. The end results tend either way can have rather detrimental effects, and to the large extent they tend to have detrimental effects. The nuclear family, you see how it creates a different environment, and it leads to a different outcome for people.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. Next, we'll finish up this last paragraph where it says, nor did it. His 4 years at one of America's most illustrious universities were far happier. Though by no means a high flyer, he impressed his tutors and finished a 4 year course in three, spending his final year editing the new student newspaper Crimson, an experience which gave him lifelong rapport with journalists and his first taste of adult politics. In short, at Harvard, Roosevelt started to find himself as a person and became a self confident young man who was taken seriously by serious people. Now, before we continue to the next paragraph, I just find it interesting how I've heard people talk about whether going to college is important or not. Um, the thing I would say is this: the networking you will get in a college environment far outweighs the cost in regards to the finances of going to school and everything. This is what you have to understand. The higher up you move in certain colleges, especially a college like Harvard, the more you're in contact with very powerful people with very powerful family connections. And even the likes of Bill Gates, who was a college dropout, he said himself that his college experience was well worth it because it gave him contact with people who, had he never been to college, never would have been able to make the type of moves in his environment that he would have had he not met them.
You know, the benefits of a higher education are self evident, and they have been self evident for thousands of years, which is why
Mm-hmm.
the institution of higher learning has been around for thousands of years. This has been well documented. Okay, so you go to college for a better education and for networking.
Mm-hmm.
Every every time that when you're met with resistance to the idea of investing, the resistance that you get are, well, not everyone is going to invest. When you propose the idea of starting a business, you get the pushback of, well, not everyone can start a business. Go to college, get an education. Well, not everyone can go to college. Well, see, here's the thing. Not everyone is going to have an IT career, and you cannot
Mm-hmm.
certificate your way through life. Okay? The rampant lowering of standards and the legacy of lowered expectations has long-term detrimental effects. The benefits of a higher education used to be an across-the-board standard that all people strove towards. For whatever reason, that is no longer the case. The benefits of a higher education are self-evident. They cannot be disputed in any way whatsoever. So, you absolutely should avail yourself of a higher education because it has been well proven and well documented 10 ways to Sunday. People who obtain a higher education tend to do better in life. So that's all that really needs to be said about that.
Yep, and I couldn't agree more. All right, so this next section is definitely something I was looking forward to talking about in this tree because it kind of gives a little bit of backdrop history on the political nature of, or I wouldn't say political nature, but pretty much the nature of U.S. politics. And so I definitely look forward to talking in this section 3. It says, other more significant events were shaping the adult world of work and politics in which Frank was moving. The Democratic Party, to which Hyde Park Roosevelts, like his father, had belonged, could trace, excuse me, could trace its origins back to Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, or even Thomas Jefferson in the 1790s. But the modern two-party system had been created by the conflict over slavery, which began in the 1840s and destroyed the earlier system. The old Whig Party of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster broke into pro and anti slavery factions and disappeared in the early 1850s. The Democrats, increasingly divided into northern and southern factions, struggled unsuccessfully to preserve unity of party and nation. The Republican Party, which emerged in the 1850s from this breakup and realignment, was a coalition determined to resist slave expansion into territories west of the Mississippi. When the Democrats finally split in 1860, the Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president with less than 40% of the poll and without a singular popular vote in 10 southern slave states. These states succeeded, Lincoln fought the Civil War to save the Union, and in defeating the South, helped destroy slavery. So this was something that I definitely did not know until I was reading up on this section or this first paragraph and then doing a little bit of research on my own. Indeed, today's modern two-party system here in America really did not come about until the late 1800s. You pretty much could say during around the time leading up to the Civil War. So the Democrats have been around for pretty much since the start of America, but Republicans didn't start to come about until towards the 1850s when the Republican Party was starting to come into different factions and all. And this is where we start to see a lot of the realignments in regards to how the Democrats were starting to think and how the Republicans were starting to think. And so, Logic Fighters, I definitely would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so um, I I was I was taught these things in school. So it's funny how these are topics that you never hear outside of academic circles because again, people don't study history and they don't want to study. So everyone is so caught up in the modern day rhetoric of binary thinking, left, right, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, but no one even knows the very background and the backstory and the history of what it is that they're actually supporting. It's just that if you grow up in a certain part of the country, if you are a certain place among the socioeconomic strata, and of course, if you are a certain ethnicity or skin color or religion, it drills into your head. You will support this party or you will support that party. That's it. No explanation why. You don't even know why. The reasons why are given to you that you never actually investigate for yourself or educate yourself on your own outside of the narratives that support this party line that you have been ingrained with. And again, that, my friends, is population control at its finest.
Hmm. Exactly. And like you mentioned, I find it interesting how, excuse me, I still have people that I have talked to since I was young. And sure, we both started off thinking the same thing as far as what we thought politics have developed and why we vote the way we vote. But then as I got older and I started to understand the hidden dynamics of these two political parties, those same individuals literally was stuck in their own time. And even to this day, they still believe some of the old teachings of, like you pointed out, you have to vote for this party because of this, or you have to vote for this party because of that. Not realizing that no, these two political parties are pretty much one and the same. This information pretty much backs that up, and how they they really can't see as to in regards to how they were forced to believe that way and how they were forced to believe they need to be emotionally involved with one political party or another. It is truly interesting to just see how you yourself have grown up as
Hmm.
far as
Hmm.
thinking politically, but the other parties are still stuck in those toddler ways of thinking.
Well, I'm gonna lay something on you here. If a person wants to take a look back and look at the list of US presidents over the last 140 years, you're going to find some very interesting things. FDR, the only president to be elected for 4 terms,
Hmm.
and his successor, President Truman, are in the past 140 years the only back-to-back Democratic presidents. So what am I saying here? If you look at the list, every other president, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, it flips every time. So people don't
Mm-hmm.
even realize that. And I'm going to bring up sports because I happen to be an avid sports fan. Whenever a franchise gets rid of its coach, whether you call him coach, manager, whatever, either term,
Mm-hmm.
the team always wants to go in a direction opposite of the coach or manager that they just fired. So if he was an offensive minded person, the next person they hire is defensive minded
Mm-hmm.
until he gets fired. Then they want to go back to an offensive minded person. So if it was a person who favors an up tempo type of style of whatever the sport is, he gets fired. The next person they want a person who favors a more slower tempo. And it's the same exact thing in America. It's binary thinking, either or. And yet no one realizes this. As my father, may he rest in peace, drilled it into my head. People have very short memories. And the same things happen every election cycle. The same empty promises are made. The same emotional arguments and attacks are leveled. And every time it's the first time ever, or it's the greatest crisis ever, or it's going to change this country forever, or that country forever. But yet it's the same cycle that's repeated over and over and over again. And that, my friends, ultimately is population control.
Indeed. Indeed. So the next paragraph says Reconstruction after the war between 1865 and 1877 set a pattern for American politics which lasted until the 1890s and in many ways until the 1930s. The Republicans, the Grand Old Party, also called today the GOP, the party of the abolition, Civil War, and military occupation after defeat, did not exist in the South. By giving millions of freed African American slaves the vote, Republicans had hoped to win back black support in a new, democratized South. But local white resistance proved invincible. By contrast, the GOP won support elsewhere. They passed the 1862 Homestead Act, which gave settlers in new states in the West free land, hoping grateful settlers would vote Republican. By the 1870s, it was no longer the purely northern sectional party which had elected Lincoln and won the war. Nevertheless, now that former Confederate states had been restored to the Union, the Democrats were once again a truly national party, with support in every region. The disputed presidential election of 1876 showed what this meant. The result was too close to call, and fraud by both sides further put the results in dispute. So, Congress brokered the Compromise of March 1877. Both sides agreed that the Republican, Rutherford Hayes, with only 48% of the popular vote, had defeated the Democratic New Yorker Samuel Tilden with 51% in the Electoral College, 185 to 184. Mr. Finest, I know where you're going with this. As soon as I heard your mic turn on, I was like, yep. Ain't it funny? Many
No.
years later. Oh, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So, so, if I were to tell you that there was a nation right now in modern times where there was an election for leadership of that country's government, and one candidate won 3 million more votes than the other candidate, yet still lost. Your first response to me would be, what third world nation is that? To which I would gladly point to you, the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
So, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I will say this. I distinctly remember when I was in school, I was taught in elementary school as a young boy that, quote, quote unquote, the founding fathers created the Electoral College because they did not want the people to make the wrong choice of president. Your vote literally does not count because ultimately it is about electoral. Well, I won't say that because people will attack me and say I'm saying don't vote. That's not what I'm saying. Is the Electoral College is what elects a president, not the popular vote. And it was
Mhm.
literally created, the specific reason stated, so that the people don't make the wrong choice. So you had an election where both sides admitted the candidate who with more total votes. They agreed that person would lose. Make of that what you will.
Yep. And once again, it's just like if somebody asks themselves, this has never happened before. Like, is there any records in history that this happened? And I'm just like, look at the history book. Do you not see the election of 1876? This is literally over 100 years later, and it's so it's almost like wow, it's a mirror of each other. You can holler and say about the candidates, but the process was literally mirrors of each other.
You know, I was surprised. I was sitting over here across the pond when this most recent U.S. electoral cycle ended. I was waiting with bated breath for someone to bring up the 2000 presidential election, hanging
Mm-hmm.
chads and dangling chads and counting votes. How one county in the state of Florida held up the entire presidential election. I was waiting for someone, but no one brought it up. No one brought it up. Why? Again, as my father, may he rest in peace, told me from when I was a little boy, people have very short memories and they don't pay attention.
Yes, yes, indeed. All right. So in the same paragraph, it says this dubious victory settled the political balance of power for a generation. The Republicans won control of national politics. The Democrats were given control of the South, where they established white supremacy. This proved a lasting settlement. Nationwide, Republicans won every presidential election between 1860 and 1912, apart from Grover Cleveland's two narrow victories in 1884 and 1882. Elections were still closely contested, while partisan rivalry in politics remained intense. The GOP had become not just the party of Union victory, but of industrial and Western expansion, high tariffs, and post war prosperity. They were backed not only by big business, banking, and finance, but also by the middle class, skilled workers, and farmers in most places outside of the Old South. Such support in the more populous states of the North and West meant Republicans usually controlled the White House, Congress, and nominations to the U.S. Supreme Court. Democrats, by contrast, not only monopolized Southern politics, but also had political presence in every state of the Union. This meant that while enjoying the benefits of a one party system at home, Southern Democrats, reelected to Congress without real opposition, could win seniority and influence on key committees such as rules, appropriations, and judiciary when they occasionally won a national majority there. So, this is pretty much interesting that because of the 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 debacle of that 1877 election, that this is where you started to see a realignment in the political landscape for the US. The Republicans started to become more of a household name, and then you had the Democrats who finally took more control over the South, and we know history in regards of what's going on, what went on down in the South. We don't need to say more on that. In fact, you have other YouTube channels that can definitely go into much history on politics down south.
Oh,
But
the verbosity never ends.
yes, indeed. But nevertheless, this is where you start to see leading up to the beginnings of World War One, how the political landscape was starting to change a bit in American society, and how this will play an important role in how Roosevelt will start to get involved.
It should be instructive to people though. If you're really listening to what we're laying out here, it should be instructive to you to understand that left wing and right wing, Republican and Democrat, left wing and right wing, it's all the same bird. Okay? Behind the scenes, they're one. They're two sides of the same coin. They work together. Everything that you see, the so-called differences, that's public theater. That is for the masses. That is bread and circuses. That is population control. That is a distraction. People people drink the Kool-Aid. They buy the lie that there is a difference between the left and a difference between the right. That is population control. One group is supposed to represent X part of the population. The other party is supposed to represent Y part of the population. So people buy into this. When you hear these terms like, well, it's a red state, or well, it's a blue state, well, the Republicans this and the Democrats that. But what you don't understand is that as citizens, as a population, you are being played because these people
Mm-hmm.
work together. Okay, so you see
Mm-hmm.
what all the way back in the 1800s, pre-arranging and predetermining the outcomes of presidential elections. They are one and the same. Everything you see from the left and the right, that is public theater. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, upon seeing the information laid at your feet right in front of you, I still guarantee 8 out of every 10 people are going to continue their lives saying, well, the Democrats this and well, the Republicans that. It is easier to fool a man than it is to convince him he has, in fact, been fooled.
Yep, indeed. And especially when you have history that clearly shows how these two parties work together to influence the masses, just as the information we're providing tonight. Sad to say, it will still fly over the heads of many people who will devoutly vote Democrat or Republican just for an emotional cause.
You know, the thing is this, right? No one wakes up in the morning and realizes that, hey, they are a sheep. People love to throw the term out, the masses or the sheep. No one wakes up and understands that they are a sheep. They are one of the masses. They are in fact being fooled. Again, it is easier to fool a man than it is to convince him he has in fact been fooled. Okay? When you control a person's mind and their mindset, you don't have to put shackles on their hands and feet. And just because a person eats eats in the projects or eats in a 25-room mansion, they're equally mentally enslaved. But I digress.
That's too much to comprehend, good sir. How can a poor man and a man that eats in a 25-bedroom house still have the same mindset of being enslaved? There has to be a difference in their thinking and mindset. But that's going too deep down the rabbit hole. So
You have to elevate your thinking because if you don't elevate your thinking, You are nothing but a piece on the board being maneuvered around in the grand game of population control.
Indeed, indeed. So this next paragraph says, since Republicans usually want support from rich, mercantile landed families like the Roosevelt, it is not immediately clear why Frank's father, James, should have been a Democrat. The Oyster Bay branch of the family, into which Frank's cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, was born in 1858, was, after all, Republican. Yet, American politics were not primarily ideological. Both parties were broad coalitions designed to make the widest possible appeal across social class and sectional interests. Party preference often became a matter of personal taste. James was growing up when the Democrat Andrew Jackson dominated the scene and matured when his style dominated politics. He had remained a Union Democrat during the Civil War. Moreover, since many of James' interests were in New York City, which was ruled by Democrats through its formidable political machine, Tammany Tammany Hall, it made sense for Hyde Park Roosevelts to be Democrats too. Now, I like the hidden fact that it talks about how American politics was not primarily ideological. Both parties pretty much had broad coalitions designed to make the widest possible appeal across social class and sectional interests. What that translated to me is the fact that both parties were literally trying to engage the same people within the social stratum. Hence, once again, the two parties always, and I mean always, talk the same talking points. There is no
And
difference between them.
there really isn't. And that's what people fail to see. So you mentioned Tammany Hall. This is brilliant because the history of New York City, and if anyone, a brilliant film by Martin Scorsese, The Gangs of New York, because the history of New York City, Tammany Hall, the political machine, okay? Politics, it's all about population control. It's all about public theater. You tell the people one thing up front, but behind the scenes, you're doing something completely different, and it's all about political power. And Tammany Hall was that political machine. Quick, quick segue.
Hmm.
That was the Irish, because New York City historically was an Irish town, not an Italian town, not controlled by the mafia. The mafia controlled three of the five main construction unions, but I digress. It's an Irish town, not an Italian town. But Tammany Hall, the political machine of New York, and that speaks to the larger political machine of the United States of America. Those two parties, behind the scenes, they're the same people. That's why they always talk about the same things. Basically, to paint a mental picture, you have a bunch of people who gather around a table, and there's a pie, and they decide how they're going to divvy up the pie and who gets what. Those people are the elites and the politicians, and that pie is the masses, the population of America. That's all that you are. So everything that you think, that you know, and you're a staunch Democrat or you're a staunch Republican, all you are is a puppet on the strings if you honestly believe that and you cannot see what's plainly in front of your face.
Yep, indeed. And the next section delves even more so into the political landscape leading up to the 1900s and what Franklin started to get more involved in as far as his personal interest in politics. So the next two paragraphs says, Party politics did not fully reflect more important forces, which were changing the nature of power between 1877 and 1900, when Roosevelt was growing into manhood. Industrialization, immigration, Western expansion, and white racism were transforming American old post war political slogans lost their force. Although in race relations, Southern whites extended segregation and second class citizenships for African Americans across the nation as a whole. Blacks in the South were denied the vote or access to law, forced to sharecrop with white landowners, confined to the least secure, lowest paid jobs, and liable to lynching at any time. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed during Reconstruction to define and protect citizenship for freed slaves. Yet, in a series of legal decisions culminating in the landmark 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled Southern segregation constitutional and imposed it on the whole nation. The fate of the 14th Amendment revealed the real balance of power in America as Roosevelt grew to manhood. For the course which struck down the rights of black Americans with such gusto eagerly used the same amendment to uphold the property rights and political power of corporate interests. Roosevelt became a progressive Northern reformer, but did so in a party where Southern white supremacists were the solid core. So I find it interesting with that political case or Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, how on the surface the Supreme Court ruled that Southern segregation is considered constitutional, but underneath it, it actually benefited the corporates more so than it benefited anybody else.
And see, it's things like that no one wants to actually talk about because separating things, yes, we all know slavery was wrong and cannot be condoned or explained or excused in any way, shape, form, or manner. However, setting aside the emotions, follow the money. When you follow
Yes.
drugs, you're going to end up with drug dealers. But when you follow the money, there's no telling where you're going to end up. Separate the emotion from the rhetoric and follow the money. That's where you will always find out who benefits ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, as you pointed out, this is a clear example of follow the money because this with using the you could say a racial type of litigation to make it seem like the 14th Amendment did not have much power overall, but hidden underneath all of the ink and all of what's written on paper, it was mainly a backroom deal that would set up the corporate side to have more power in politics and whatnot going forward into America and beyond. That I just find it interesting how it really went over the heads of a lot of folks when they'll talk about this case and how racially charged it was and all. But as you say, if you don't follow the money, you're not going to understand why they want you to believe it was racially charged.
Because that doesn't fit the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't fit the narrative that we were all told, that we've all been ingrained with. Because it was about money. You have to understand something. Slavery has existed on this planet for thousands of years,
Mm-hmm.
all over the entire planet. And people have been enslaving each other and their own as long as people have been on this planet. But again, no one wants to talk about that. Africans enslaved Africans, Europeans enslaved Europeans, Asians enslaved Asians. And then, they started enslaving each other. So even in this case, you can see clearly it was about the money. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if we really want to go down a rabbit hole that no one wants to talk about, because it totally goes against every emotional narrative that you have been told, then we can talk about how across the country in the late 1800s, how there were black and white people who lived and worked together. I'm going to repeat that: lived and worked together. But in order to break the first unions, it was said, okay, let's divide the people. And that is when you started to see, as a mainstream force, the whole white versus black thing. But see, no one wants to
Mm-hmm.
talk about that, and that's buried. I was fortunate that I happened to come across black and white written historical proof of that. But again,
And,
things that fight the narrative, because ultimately it was always about the money. Follow the money.
yep. Can't go wrong when you follow the money. Because that's where the real hidden truth is. Just like they talk about how don't believe what a person say, watch what they do. When it comes down to how nations work, follow where the money goes. Can't go wrong doing that.
Nothing else matters.
Nothing
All the
else
rhetoric,
matters.
whether you like the rhetoric or not, whether the rhetoric benefits you or not, it still doesn't matter. Follow the money, because if you're happy and the rhetoric benefits you, follow the money, because maybe you come to find out, even though you're happy, you're only getting crumbs. Follow
Mm-hmm.
the money.
Yep. Yep.
And one one last thing, let me say this. In the United States of America, I'm going to throw some different numbers. Only 2% of the population of the United States of America generates a six-figure income. 2%. As a part of that number, you have to include athletes, entertainers, doctors, and lawyers. Only 2% of the total population of the United States of America generate at least $100,000 a year in salary. Let that sink in. Now, less than 1% of the population in the United States of America generates an income of at least $250,000. And you have to include in that number athletes, entertainers, doctors, and lawyers. America is a nation of working poor. You just don't realize it, because you're all living in gilded cages. But again, I digress, because that goes against the narrative.
Indeed. Alrighty. So the next paragraph says Roosevelt was uninterested in seeking a cure for poisoned race relations. The reforms he came to embrace were designed to tame the growing power of corporate America. This new corporate power sprang from industrialization, which was further transforming the nation. Between 1870 and the 1900s, the United States grew from fourth to first place among industrial nations of the world, exploiting her abundant natural resources. A new class of capitalist entrepreneurs made America not just a rival nation to Britain, France, and Germany, but a rival continent to all of Europe. By 1900, free competition was creating consolidation. With the weakest economic enterprises driven to the wall, mergers led to a system of cartels, monopolies, and syndicates known as trusts. Largely formed in the late 1890s and early 1900s, trusts were the symbol of corporate power. The first billion-dollar trust was United States Steel, formed in 1900. Trusts not only revolutionized industrial production, transport, and communications, but also increasingly controlled America's services and public utilities, her financial and economic life. The old middle class, doctors, lawyers, preachers, have been swept aside. The new captains of the industry, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and the financier J.P. Morgan, dwarfed even old families like the Roosevelts. So again, follow the money. And especially in this case where we are witnessing the industrialization of this time, how the manufacturing processes, the automation processes, because there were some automations that happened during this time, it pretty much helped to revolutionize the American life. And like it just pointed out in this last paragraph, the old middle class, which, you were something if you became a doctor, you became a lawyer, or you became a preacher, essentially you was pretty much, you were relegated to a new social class. Now you have to deal with the likes of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. These were the new elites that started to emerge in America.
There are three questions that if you're gonna take an intellectual, if you're gonna take an intelligent, let's leave the intellectualism aside. There are three questions you have to ask if you're going to take an intelligent point of view. Number one, compared to what? Number two, how much is it going to cost? Number three, do you have hard data? So, when industrialization came at the start of the 20th century, people complained about new technologies in industrialization. Did it destroy America? Did it destroy the quote-unquote American way of life? Again, compared to what? What did it cost? Where was your hard data? So, when people tell you that the fourth industrial revolution is going to destroy America, ruin the American way of life, I ask you, compared to what? Two, what is it going to cost? Three, where is your hard data? Because I have hard data. We see it. You're living in it. You're living in the fourth industrial revolution. Where did that come from? From the third industrial revolution. Technology and automation will not destroy any country. It will not destroy the way of life of any country. That nation will move forward, as it always does, as every country does. But again, you can either be emotional and go with the rhetoric and the narratives, or you can look at the hard data. Again, compared to what? What will it cost you? Where was your hard data?
Yep, indeed. And I find it interesting that, and I've talked about this in another video, how technology really is the divider, especially as it starts to get more and more industrialized, and especially when it gets more and more enthralled in everyday life. A person who embraces technology, essentially he or she is a globalist, because that's how you're able to connect to the world. Without technology, you're really going to be part of the Stone Age. And for those who are anti-technology, they're the ones who will argue you down about, well, we need to be isolated. We need to get away from all the gadgets and all the industrialization, and we just need to just have small communities.
Go
And
live on a farm and farm. Live off the land.
yeah,
Hey man, listen, there's a reason why we have farms, and they seem to farm to feed the world. But here's the thing, right? Again, if you study history, there was a time people badmouth the zipper because we have buttons. What's wrong with buttons? People badmouth the zipper. People badmouthed people badmouth Edison and his electricity. Actually, they badmouth Tesla and his electricity
Oh,
because
yes.
Tesla beat Edison to that. Okay, check the history. But
Hmm.
Tesla, Edison, Westinghouse, these men were castigated with their electricity and their light bulbs and their industrialization. Carnegie with his steel mills and his railroad tracks, and Rockefeller with his oil wells. What are these men doing? So, again, technology has always been the way forward. You know,
Hmm.
always the people, the people fear. Okay, there's always fear. People who are the lowest skilled, the lowest educated, always fear anything new and fear technology, and they fear that they will be displaced. So here's the thing: wherever you are wherever you are upon the socioeconomic strata, imbue yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for, and you can literally create the reality that you want to see. It really is that. It really is that simple. If you have the skills people are willing to pay for, you can create your own way in life. But it is easier to be a victim and blame others for your choices in life because we are all the sum total of our choices in life.
Yep. Indeed. Couldn't agree more. The next two paragraphs says, moreover, the Roosevelts and other established landowners felt threatened not only from above, but from below. Unrestricted immigration from Europe provided an endless supply of labor, ethnic, ethnically diverse, and often unused to life in a modern, urban industrial democracy. Some struggled to form trade unions to protect their wages, hours, and conditions, but with little success. The interests of skilled workers were opposed to those of unskilled. Competing amongst themselves, the working class were exploited not only by employers, but also by those who ran the politics of America's teeming cities. The first great wave of immigrants had been Irish, fleeing famine in the 1840s. Political forces created by anti Catholicism, xenophobia, and party breakup over slavery and secession, combined to make Irish Americans vote overwhelmingly Democratic, the first ethnic group to give such solid support to one party.
Bingo.
Other yep, other immigrants, such as Germans, who eventually outnumbered all others, voted Democrat or Republican according to the time, place, and circumstance. But whichever party they joined, the main point was that within a generation, such ethnic groups were tending to run the politics of big cities. I want to touch on that real quick. So,
But you're being told run away from big cities, go live on a farm, prep for doomsday. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. Ah! Your economic centers have always been cities. Always.
mhm.
Always. I mean, if you check out through history, even to the quote unquote Stone Age, before we even had pyramids, cities have always been your economic centers. And where were they? Located on a coast by necessity. The first way to move goods and services over large distances was by ship. And still remains that way to this day. Yes, we have airplanes, but where are your largest economic centers? They all exist on a coast or a river. City. There's a reason why your economic centers are in cities. But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, not at all. I'm glad you pointed that out. And even from a seaport standpoint, when you look at America, two of your biggest seaport cities in America, one is in New York the other in Los Angeles. Both of those are considered the gateways to American politics. Whoever was able to build up enough of a following in just those two cities pretty much were the faces of American politics, even in this day and time. So, like you rightfully pointed out, the big cities are the ones where people control what the other countryside and other smaller cities are going to follow suit in policies and whatever is, as they say, the target of the day.
You know, a quick aside, we're all experiencing the same thing. Well, excuse me, we're all experiencing the same thing right now. Okay, so that cannot be glossed over.
Mm-hmm.
And you are seeing migrations out of certain larger cities. Again, cannot be dismissed or glossed over. I would posit, however, that when a new normal is found in whatever shape or form the new normal will take, whatever shape or form or manner the new normal will take, I'm willing to bet my next day pass at the Nürburgring for a track day that you will see migrations heading back toward large cities in
Yep.
whatever numbers that may be.
Yep. I agree. All right. So the same paragraph says that, but whichever party they join, the main point was that within a generation, such ethnic groups were tending to run the politics of big cities. Bosses organized political machines to control municipal democracy. Tammany Hall, which ruled New York City in Roosevelt's own state, was the oldest and most notorious political machine in America. But similar machines flourish in other cities such as Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and St. Louis.
I just want to really quick interject here. Tammany
Mm,
Hall was run by the Irish. And that's why to this day, New York City and Boston and Philly and Chicago have such large Irish influences, political influences, and communities. Because historically, the political power bases of those cities were the Irish. The
mm-hmm.
Italians actually did not come into power actually in New York City until the 50s and 60s. We know about the mafia, but that was different. But as a people, you didn't really see them really gain their own until the 50s and 60s. So going back to this time, the Irish. I'm sorry, please go.
Oh, no, no. I'm glad for that history tidbit as well. It says machine politics grew when services and favors were traded for votes, with bosses supplying somewhat ramshackle welfare and institutional structure to bourgeoising municipal government. So, as the 20th century opened, those who had traditionally provided political leadership, like the Roosevelts, believed American democracy was now under increasing attack. In the South, largely untouched by industrialization and immigration, white supremacists ran politics and race relations. In the national economy, the new captains of industry stifled free enterprise and bought influence wholesale. In the cities, which were growing at such phenomenal pace, corrupt political bosses ruled. In industry, labor unions clamored for more and more strikes, clamored for more and led strikes, excuse me. Faced with all this, campaigns for reform, often led by the American middle class, began to emerge. Such reform was essentially conservative, designed to enhance middle class control of the American system of democracy and free enterprise.
Uh oh. Uh
Thus,
oh. Uh oh.
I was just about to get to it. That ain't it funny how we are also in this day and age seeing history repeats itself, where you have people talking about, I'm just gonna come out and say it, let's make America great again.
when you don't even know the history. You throw around terms and you don't even know the history of where these terms come from.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that is part and parcel of what happens to any populace, and that's how people are. Again, population control. I keep hammering it, and I hammer it, and I hammer it. It's population control.
Yep. At the end of the day, follow the money, and you'll find the true skeleton behind the closet. All right. Next, it says, yet reform began in rural America. In 1890, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to attack monopoly. Since Reconstruction, currency reform had long been popular with Western farmers, anxious to relieve their crushing burden of debt. What a farmer could have repaid with 1,000 bushels of wheat in 1865 now costs 3,000 bushels. In the 1890s, chronically indebted farmers launched the new populist political party in western grain and silver states and in parts of the South, which urged farmers to demand that the dollar be backed by silver as well as gold. Free silver, by increasing money supply, would ease the pain of chronic debt. At first, it proved so irresistible that Democrats merged with populists to back the great evangelical orator W. J. Bryan in the 1896 presidential election. But the populist demand for free silver terrified bankers and the urban middle or skilled working class, who were frightened into voting for Bryan's opponent, William McKinley, giving the GOP the biggest share of the popular vote won by any party since 1872. Populism rapidly declined, and free silver became a hearsay, like free love.
Doesn't that sound a lot like current American politics?
Oh, yes.
The history repeats itself, but no one studies history. They believe
Mm,
everything that they're told that fits an emotional narrative. And it's an old, as long as you tap into someone's emotions, you can control their actions.
yep. Yep. And I find it interesting how it's almost similar to what was going on in the same time in regards to the revolution in Russia, in regards to the poor class wanted to have a free society where for them everything was given freely. But the difference between how America responded to it versus how Russia had a smaller, you could say, middle class compared to America. So in essence, Russia was visually about to be overtaken by the lower middle class or poor class. So that's how the revolution really got started off. Whereas
Right.
here in America, because the middle class and especially the upper class still had more control over politics, hint, hint, they were able to thwart off the so called free silver and free love that the Democrats were really trying to push during that time.
You know, all you have to do is instill fear in a person. You know, I I was laughing hysterically. I fell out of my chair when after 9/11, I saw on the news grain farmers in West nowhere were fearful that terrorists were coming to blow up their grain silos. And I'm scratching my head like,
Wow.
dude, the Twin Towers got hit. The Twin Towers are gone. No one wants your grain silos. And I was scratching my head wondering how federal money from the newly formed Department of Homeland Security, how New York State received less money than other states around the country. And it boggles my mind. But no, well, it didn't boggle my mind. I was being facetious. To me, it was amusing how once you instill fear in people, you can do whatever you want.
Yep. Yep. Instill fear. You can control. Oh my goodness.
You can
Is
control the narrative, and people who run with the narrative. And if you are a person who elevates the thinking, and if you ask questions that make people think and or goes against the established narrative, you will be name called, you will be attacked, you will be mocked and ridiculed, but your points cannot be countered on any intelligent basis.
Yep. Absolutely. So next, this last paragraph says, but other reformers took up the rest of the populist program of reform, calling themselves progressives. These reformers entered the 20th century demanding more effective antitrust measures, primary elections to defeat political bosses, women's suffrage, direct election of senators, federal income tax, a Federal Reserve Bank, railway regulation, greater popular control of the political economy. Populists had been agrarian and sectional, confined to the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and parts of the South, only briefly influencing the Democrats. The new progressives were predominantly urban, small businessmen, professional middle class, and skilled working class who successfully penetrated both parties nationwide. They concentrated on two goals: breaking the monopoly power of the trust and ending the political corruption of the bosses and their machines. The theme of progressivism was regulation and control of the economy and the political process in the public interest. As Roosevelt came of age and went up to Harvard, progressive ideas were shaping his approach to political power. Now, I find it interesting that if you look at today's ideals of progressivism, people's today, their mindset of progressivism, it is definitely different compared to how progressivism was shaped back then. And what I mean by that is today's progressive mindset or progressivism was more so inclusive, or at least that's what they tell you is more so inclusive. Whereas back then, as you can see, their progressivism was more so of control and making sure that the big boys up top or the big man up top somehow looked after the little man in some form or fashion.
Yeah, 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 I
Elijah found
largely.
it sounds like your microphone is a little muffled.
Sorry, sorry. How do I sound now? Sorry.
Oh, sounds very good.
Yeah. Yes. What I was gonna say is, yeah, I largely agree with what you said. Um, from what I see, what counts for, as I said earlier, again, compared to what, what's the cost, and where is your hard data? So, compared to what, a lot of what passes for so-called progressivism now, like they're they're so progressive, they're regressive. Like
Mm-hmm.
pushing ideas that largely ridicule men, feminism, and you want to destroy the nuclear family. And you
Mm-hmm.
want to turn on its ear the idea of traditional established male and female roles. So how is that in any way actually progressive? Like that's regressive. Like you just want to destroy the idea of the nuclear family. But with all of that said, uh, the Federal Reserve Bank. Here's the thing: Every country needs a central bank. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
the days of the royal coffers are over. So central bank places the royal coffers. Every country needs a central bank. But here's the problem: the United States of America, the central bank, is not part of the federal government. The Federal Reserve Bank is not a government agency. It is literally a private bank owned by private citizens. It is
Mm-hmm.
not a part of the federal government. So there are quote unquote 12 or 13 or 11 bankers. Don't quote me, forgive me. But it's a private bank owned by private citizens. That's who controls the banking system of the United States. That's who controls the money. So the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, yes, he may be appointed by the president, but he's not a government employee. He's a private citizen and the
Mm-hmm.
employee of a private bank, a privately held business. So let that sink in. Again, follow the what? The money.
Follow the money. Indeed. Well, while the audience kind of chew on that for a bit, the next two paragraphs says, then something unexpected happened, which dramatized the importance of political power both to the Roosevelt family and the nation. His cousin, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, suddenly became President of the United States when McKinley was assassinated on the 14th of September, 1901. Teddy Roosevelt, or TR as he was known, came from the Oyster Bay Republican branch of the family. He had been elected governor of New York in 1898 and then McKinley's vice president in 1901. His accidental transition to the White House personified the arrival of progressivism center stage. For although at 42, the youngest president in history, TR was clearly already a great man, combining first class brains with tireless energy, ambition, vision, and a policy which he later orchestrated into the new nationalism. Bristling with buck teeth and jingoism, Teddy Roosevelt also had remarkable physical presence and a genius for self dramatization. Such was his fame as a hunter that the teddy bear was named after him. Seizing the leadership of the progressive reform movement as president after 1901, TR embarked on a series of high profile antitrust suits like the Northern Securities case, ostensibly to break up monopoly capitalism. Billion-dollar trusts were being reformed by corporate takeovers and mergers despite the Sherman Antitrust Act. Progressives believed that these monopolies, such as Standard Oil and American Tobacco, threatened free enterprises, free institutions, and the whole American concept of the public good. So, in the first decade of the new century, progressives in both parties were struggling to establish popular political control over corporate capitalism. Using the White House, in his own words, as a bully pulpit, Teddy Roosevelt was not just the first progressive president, but first of the modern presidents, expanding the power and influence of both presidencies and federal government. He also combined demands for social reform at home with jingoism abroad. Having famously led the Rough Riders in the 1898 Spanish American War, as president, he forced Colombia to cede territory on which America built the Panama Canal to expand her naval and imperial ambitions. So, right here in these two paragraphs, this is where we really start to see the Roosevelts start to gain that political power within their family name. Just like with the Kennedys, just like with the Rockefellers, once they really started to get a hold of the powers within the American politics, now you started to see, as they say, their true self started to come out. And I'm glad that the last paragraph highlighted that it was actually during Teddy Roosevelt's presidencies that imperialism really started to take off for America.
You know what? Long live the Monroe Doctrine, the manifest destiny. Because what business of it was it of the United States to force to force another country to give up land so that it can create the Panama Canal? But there you go, the manifest destiny, the
Mm-hmm.
Monroe Doctrine.
Yep.
And it's funny that Teddy Roosevelt, for those who are aware, as you just read, he led the attack on monopolies, breaking up U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. So John D. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, largest oil company in the world at that time. The largest remnant of the company that were when Standard Oil was broken up, it was broken up into several companies. The largest of those companies discovered oil in the country of Arabia, and Ibn Saud signed a contract with the company, and he put himself up as king, renamed the country Saudi Arabia after himself, and the rest is history. But I say all that to say, you see how, as you just said, American imperialism starting to assert itself on the global stage. That's
Mm-hmm.
why I mentioned Standard Oil and the breakup, and Ibn Saud, the first king of the renamed Arabia, Saudi Arabia, which he named after himself.
Again, like you always say, just follow the
Follow the
money
money.
and you will understand why nations did what they did.
Because I wouldn't be surprised. And again, maybe no, you know what? I will leave that to myself. But I would not be surprised if somewhere along the way, maybe I'm totally shooting in the dark, but I would not be surprised if somehow, some kind of way, the name of this family, I wouldn't be surprised if they somehow had a piece of Aramco. And if not Aramco,
Mm.
at least Standard Oil, which would have led them to get into some profits from Aramco. Again, maybe I'm totally shooting in the dark. I'm just thinking out loud. I would not be surprised. I don't know. I'm not theorizing, but I would not be surprised.
Yeah, we would definitely have to do a deep dive on that one because I myself, I kind of have a hunch in some way they had a hand in Aramco, but I can't, I can't really, as they say, shoot the target because right now there's not much evidence that I could find. But I could definitely say I feel at least within over 60%, they definitely have some sort of hand in that regard. So I'm definitely with you on that. All right. Next it says, an overbearing but essentially kindly man. He found time too to show an affectionate interest in young cousin Frank's life, writing letters and meeting him. Excuse me. There is no doubt either that Frank was strongly influenced by the older Roosevelt's example. Though he belonged to the opposing political party, Frank, in common with many college men of his generation, saw himself as a progressive. He supported Teddy's attack on monopoly, labor unrest, and political corruption. He voted for him in 1904, his first vote for a president, not from family affection, but, quote, because I thought he was a better Democrat than the Democratic candidate, the conservative nonentity Alton Parker. Since Teddy Roosevelt was president until 1909, during which time he dominated political debate, Frank's agenda, as he began his own quest for power, was partly set by TR. He supported the president's Florida tax on malefactors of great wealth who monopolized American capitalism and thus denied democratic opportunity. As president, Teddy Roosevelt's attack on the trusts were largely moral and ceremonial in character, designed to relieve middle class anxiety about monopoly and scare capitalists into accepting self regulation for fear of being forced to accept something worse. Frank learned a lot about the importance of appearance in American politics from this, and later became a master at applying that lesson himself. Both Roosevelts also believed that conservation of America's natural resources against the predatory instincts of those who sought to exploit them for gain was the key political issue of the day. Indeed, throughout his life, conservation was the issue closest to Frank's heart. He liked to copy his cousin in other ways too, while evolving his own political beliefs, style, and voice. He took to wearing Teddy's type of eyeglasses, used the term bully to express approval, and pronounced himself delighted with something pleasing. Many American men of the progressive period did the same. Franklin Roosevelt alone could already nurture serious ambitions that one day he might follow in his cousin's footsteps. When, as a small boy, his father had introduced him to Grover Cleveland, the president who dolefully hoped Frank would never grow up to become president himself. Years later, when asked how he enjoyed the job, Cousin Teddy had flashed his teeth at his young cousin and replied, "Ripping, simply rippling." Gleefully recalling this contrast, FDR left no doubt which view he took of becoming president. So interesting how having a relative who's already been in the White House, how that started to shape his mindset on literally becoming president of the United States. I find it interesting that during the same time frame, while Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, and even in you can say to an extent Churchill, how these guys were still trying to feel their way into politics. And in the case of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, they were still trying to find themselves in regards to what their purpose was in life. Here you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, who already come from a well-to-do family, a family who already had some sense of political influence, but even before Teddy Roosevelt got in there. But now that Teddy Roosevelt is president of the United States, all of a sudden FDR has grand ideas of how he wants to shape the American landscape and to a further extent shape how the world will function. In that regard, he was well ahead of the curve in regards to the aforementioned members when it came down to politics.
He certainly was, but again, we've seen how the culture that he grew up in shaped his mindset. And that mindset led to him shaping the American culture as he would reshape it after and during the Great Depression. Again, I cannot overstate it, the importance of culture and mindset. It is brilliantly laid out here. I really cannot add much more to this. If as a person in life, if you want extraordinary results, you have to develop an extraordinary mindset because your mindset governs everything that you will do in life. And your mindset is shaped by the culture that you grew up in. So, if you don't want the same, if you don't like your current circumstances, change your mindset. And if you don't want your offspring to be in the situation you're currently in, change your mindset so you can change and influence and change and develop a new culture for your offspring. which will in turn affect what? Their mindset. Culture and mindset, the two are inextricably linked, and both are very important.
Yep, indeed. Now we come to the last section of this chapter to wrap up on this particular stream. And this is where things start to get more interesting in regards to the mindsets of those time. So it says, though his cousin's dazzling example in those years helped focus Frank's aim on winning political power, something of more short term significance was happening in his private life. While studying at Harvard, he had met and fallen in love with Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, his own fifth cousin, 2 years his senior. Unlike Frank's idyllic childhood, Eleanor's had been miserably unhappy. Her beautiful mother, Anna, brought little Nell up to believe she was ugly. Her father, Elliot, Uncle Teddy's brother, whom she adored, was a drunk. When she was 8, her mother died, so Nell was sent to live with the grandmother. 2 years later, her father also died. Now sent to live with, now an orphan, Eleanor's salvation came when at 15 she was sent to Ellenswood, a British girls' boarding school. Her gifted French head teacher, Mary Sylvester, saw her talents, helped her find them, and encouraged her to use them in adult life. But when she met Frank, this socially prominent debutante was not interested in politics. She was seeking the happiness and security she had lacked as a child. As their courtship progressed, she believed that beneath his easygoing, fun-loving exterior, Frank could give her what she craved. All his life, in his own or in America's greatest crisis, FDR always loved a good time. Eleanor soon discerned that beneath the surface hedonism, the playboy Harvard graduate, the dilettante and editor of criticism, was a serious and dependable young man. So, just like with Mussolini, how should I put this? We see how, this is just my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
and take with it as you will, the audience or whatnot. But this is what happens with, even for a person like Frank, who certainly could have ventured out into the world and found women of other cultures like where he come from. When you are resorting to a closed-minded community, at least within his private life, people could do some desperate things. And in the case of Roosevelt and Mussolini, no difference in regards to how they sought their married life. You know, you had Mussolini, we just read, where the man literally married his, essentially his half sister, because they both had the same father. Whereas here with Roosevelt, even though you could say, yes, they're fifth cousins, they definitely are not too far off on the family tree, if you want to look at it in that manner.
Well, I'll say this before I dive into that: culture, a mindset. So you see how young Eleanor was not born with a silver spoon in her mouth.
Mm-mm.
And so she understood the common person. And at that
Mm-hmm.
point in time, there was no middle class yet. You were either poor or you were rich. There was no
Mm-hmm.
in between. The middle class did not exist. People cannot imagine being actual poor. You were either poor or rich. There was no in between. So where am I going with this? The culture that Eleanor grew up in shaped her mindset. She was about helping people because she came up from nothing. Everyone knows the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, first ebony pilots in the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army Air Force. The Air Force at that time was a part of the Army. That was the brainchild of one Eleanor Roosevelt. I bet you didn't know that part of that story.
No, I
Eleanor
did not.
Roosevelt. That was her brainchild. She pushed that. So
Wow.
yes, that was her baby. Culture and
Wow.
mindset.
Indeed. Indeed. Um, Seattle Shy Show. Good to see you, sir. The War Room is not an open panel. This is mainly just a series of projects that me and Logic Finance come together, where we mainly just talk about the history and the crooks and crannies of the political people involved, the figureheads, and eventually we're going to get into the huge events of World War II and the aftermaths behind it. But definitely, the feedbacks we get provided on these shows, we definitely hit those up and talk about them on the streams and whatnot. But in regards to this being an open panel, this series is essentially, just off limits to just me and Paul. But yeah, we definitely, appreciate feedbacks in regards to that, and we talk about them behind the scenes and eventually into the shows. But moving on, the next two paragraphs say his mother, Sarah, talking about Frank's mother, however, knew nothing about Eleanor until they announced their engagement. Possessive love made her oppose the idea. Uh oh. But though she tried to break it up, she was finally reconciled. They were married on the 17th of March, 1905. St. Patrick's Day, such an important political holiday in New York City that the sound of the Tammany Parade nearly drowned the responses. Yet they had picked that date so that Eleanor's uncle Teddy could attend to give away the bride in a ceremony conducted by Frank's former headmaster, Endicott Peabody. For the fashionable guests, it was the wedding of the year. No one could then see, except by clairvoyance, that it was the start of the most important American political marriage of the 20th century. Eleanor eventually bore her husband a daughter named Anna and 5 sons, one of whom died in infancy, to add luster to the Roosevelt name. Meanwhile, Frank was taking the first steps in his political career. After Harvard, he went to Columbia Law School, but with no great enthusiasm. When he got married, it did not seem necessary to complete the university law course. So, in 1906, he passed the New York State bar exam, but did not graduate from Columbia. Much later, joshed by University President Nicholas Murray Butler, that, quote, you will never be able to call yourself an intellectual until you come back to Columbia and pass your law exams. FDR laughingly retorted, quote, that just shows how unimportant the law really is. Wow. Oh, man. See, that shows you how money essentially can I won't say put you above the law, but when you come from a family of influence, you can make those reports just how FDR just told the university president at the time of Columbia, Nicholas Murray Butler, Nicholas over here saying you'll never be able to call yourself an intellect if you don't come back to Columbia and finish up. FDR's like, okay, well, I guess it just really shows how important the law really is then.
You know, you won't say it. I will say it. I learned that. I learned that back in the 1980s when the U.S. government had when the U.S. government had the Iran Contra affair. It was called the Iran Contra affair. So the U.S. Congress launched an investigation into the Iran Contra affair. So the hearings, the outcome, which was, I learned the rule of law in the United States of America is an absolute joke. It is meaningless. It is nothing but words because Colonel Oliver North walked away scot free. Vice President George Bush at that time, who was the director of the CIA, who personally directed Oliver North to run this program back in the late 70s, he walked away scot free. The current director of the CIA, I want to say his name was Admiral Secord, don't quote me, he walked away scot free. So here's what I learned. As long as you have the right friends, you can literally break any law possible, including murder, and you will walk away scot free as long as you have the right friends. The rule of law
Mm-hmm.
means absolutely nothing. That's what I
Mm-hmm. No, you are definitely spot on.
because I think it was summertime or maybe it was school break, and I remember coming inside the house and watching those hearings every day because I remember Senator Daniel Inouye, the first Hawaiian elected to Congress. Anyway, the rule of law, absolutely meaningless in the United States. As long as you have the right friends, you can do anything, break any law. Does not matter. You will walk away scot free. And for those who are unawares, just Google the Iran Contra affair, Colonel Oliver North,
Yep.
and the man who was the director of the CIA in the late 70s, George Bush, who became vice president and who became a one-term president.
Yep. Indeed. So next it says the idea that he was remotely interested in becoming an intellectual shows how little Butler understood him. Yet later, FDR explained, quote, you know you don't learn law at our law schools. You learn how to think. Unlike Cousin Teddy, voracious reader and writer of substantial historical works, he was not interested in books, though he later came to value the company of those who were. Meanwhile, having passed the state bar exam, he played at rather than practiced law in New York City. With his great fortune and family name, he might have done what young men from the leisure class commonly did by joining the idle, rich, and dabbling in politics as his father had done. But that was not the FDR way. True, he joined Carter, Ledyard, and Milborn at 54 Wall Street, a blue chip firm whose best clients, big corporations like Standard Oil of Ohio and American Tobacco, were the very people who were vigorously fighting Theodore Roosevelt's antitrust suits in federal court. That his law firm should be in the vanguard of resistance to the central thrust of progressive reform was yet another FDR irony. But the young lawyer was too junior to take part in these legal battles against trust busting. Instead, he became interested in municipal court work, where cases involving poor clients, rather than those who could afford to pay fat fees, went to trial. Municipal court involved the daily life of New York City, and this meant daily involvement with city politics, run most years by the Democrats through Tammany Hall, the oldest political machine in America. Tammany's boss, Charles F. Murphy, became an example of the new kind of more responsible urban politician emerging during the Progressive period in contrast to crooks like his predecessor, Richard Croker, who usually ran affairs in urban America. Municipal court helped Roosevelt understand the way American politics worked up in the real world, as opposed to Harvard textbooks. So interesting, we see here that right after college, he gets involved in one of the biggest law firms in New York City at the time, the 54 Wall Street. And instead of being involved in the bigger clients that were, going up against his cousin in regards to the antitrust, FDR was more focused on just the lower caseworks and lower court works in that regard. And it's interesting how just being involved in that lower mindset truly shows how he wanted to be more in the dirty work, you could say, as opposed to just being involved in the big wigs of judicial court systems.
Yeah, personally, I would attribute that to his wife, Eleanor. It was her influence because she came from nothing, and I think that had her upbringing and her mindset had such a huge effect on him. It allowed him to see things from a different perspective because he came from money. He came from old money.
Mm-hmm.
So this was not the man. Had you looked, as you now have, as we now have, had you looked at his background and upbringing, and you stopped right there, you would not think that this is the man who came up with the New Deal and all of the various programs that he instituted to turn the country around after the Great Depression when he was elected president. But I will say this, and I'm saying this to poke certain people, but certain mindsets. The United States Army was segregated. It was Eleanor Roosevelt, as First Lady, who pushed that start for the U.S. Army to become fully integrated. The Tuskegee Airmen, that was her creation, literally. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The United States Navy was segregated. Yes, you can join the Navy, but you can only be either a cook or basically a janitor. As we saw Dory Miller, who shot down 5 planes or 6 Zeros, won the Navy Cross, and now has an aircraft carrier named after him that will be built after the Enterprise. Eleanor Roosevelt was the one who pushed for full integration in the U.S. military.
And I'm glad you brought that up because kind of doing a little SYSBM side, rumor has it that when she met up with the generals of the Army and even of the Navy, the admirals of the Navy, to talk about integration, rumor has it that as the generals were fighting her in regards to integration with blacks coming into the Army and the Navy, she was quoted as telling them, if your sons go off to fight in wars and they don't come back home alive, who else will your daughters start to turn to? And it was said after she made that statement, the generals and the admirals all of a sudden were all for integration.
I have to admit, I have heard, I have read that anecdote. I was never sure how true that was, but
Yeah, I'm still trying to find more information about it, but it is
yeah,
true that she did push very hard for integration in the military. And it
she
was because of her work that leading up to World War II, the Army started to integrate more and more black men into the military. And so, what was the defining factor? Who knows? But that was definitely a rumor that she told the generals and the admirals that y'all probably want to start integrating the young black men into the army, because if we ever fight off in a big war and your sons don't come back, who else are your daughters going to deal with?
You know what? It's funny. I have a feeling that when, excuse me, when we get around to it, we're going to cover the U.S. Servicemen who took up wives and had children in Britain and in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another conversation for another stream. And when I say U.S. ebony servicemen who took up wives and had children in England and in Germany and France
Yep, and also in Japan and all. In fact,
and
I
Japan,
can't
yes,
wait.
yes.
I can't wait when we really talk about that subject, because, in my opinion, even though ebony men have already started to travel, as it's hard to believe, but yes, back in those days, ebony men were definitely able to travel abroad and whatnot. World War II, in my honest opinion, was really the foundation of today's modern SYSBM type of lifestyle. That's when
Mhm.
ebony men really got the chance to travel the world and really become a part of other cultures that accumulated in today's type of integration, in my honest opinion.
You know, my grandfather was in the U.S. Army. He fought in Italy, North Africa, and Europe. And my father, may he rest in peace, told me that my grandfather, he did not want to come back home, but he had a wife, he had a son, so he came back home. But he said he returned back to a country that treated him like how they treated him. And he said he did not want to come back. Had he not been married to my grandma and had my father waiting for him to come back home as a young lad, he never would have come back home. That's how that's how much he fell in love with the culture and the lifestyle and the treatment that he got as a U.S. service member during the war.
Yep, very true. Very true. So the next two paragraphs says, during this period, he expressed for the first time political ambitions. A fellow law clerk remembered him saying at work one day in 1907, quote, with engaging frankness, that he planned to run for public office soon and that he wanted to become president. Cousin Teddy supplied the motto. First, the State Assembly, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, then Governor of New York. Anyone who is Governor of New York, he concluded, quote, has a good chance to become president with any luck. The last part was certainly true. In 9 of the 16 campaigns between the Civil War in 1932, one of the two leading candidates was either a governor or a former governor of New York. Seymour, Tilden, Cleveland, 3 elections, Theodore Roosevelt, twice, Hughes, and Smith. Of this group, 5 were Democrats. So there it was. At the age of 25, Roosevelt was seriously seeking political power. As a New Yorker, he knew that this meant he must learn to work with men like Murphy. But at the same time, he aspired to walk in the footsteps of Cousin Teddy, who, in 1907, dominated the American political scene. Insofar as he had a political agenda at this stage of his life, he aimed at tackling both bosses who ran machine politics and plutocrats who ran the trusts, forcing, forcing both to accept new responsibilities. However, conservation of America's environment and its resources was the issue closest to his heart, And as he matured, he orchestrated a policy of management of American resources for the public good. Yet, it is important to grasp, that at this stage, FDR was already bored with the life of a lawyer and wanted the fun and excitement politics would bring. So, as the author pointed out, or the biographer pointed out, essentially, Teddy Roosevelt laid out the model and foundation of how FDR, if he was very serious, how he could become president of the United States. And it's interesting that that little tidbit within the beginning of the paragraph talked about how between the Civil War in 1932, that 9 of the 16 campaigns had candidates who were either governors or former governors of New York. I find that
Nelson
very interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York. He tried to run, started to run for president. Didn't go very far, but governor of New York. So yeah, it seems it has a certain prestige to it to be governor of the state of New York.
Yep,
Politically.
that's true. That's why, a little side note, that's why I'm kind of keeping a little pulse on Mr. Como currently in New York, because I'm also curious too as far as what would be his next political move in regards to rumors saying that he may throw his hat in the 2024 election. So,
Funny you say that because I asked the question when he had so much political goodwill attacking attacking the president over his COVID response. It was like the entire country knew Andrew Cuomo's name, and the man was walking on water. And it seemed
hmm
to me, and I started to ask the question among certain people. I said, I wonder if Andrew Cuomo is going to run for president in 4 years. Now, we see apparently he's getting slammed now over something behind the uh, nursing home things. I
hmm
haven't followed that story at all, but the point is, I would not be surprised if he tried to run for president because he had so much political goodwill. But, politics makes for strange bedfellows, so you never know how these things turn out. As the old saying goes, politics makes for strange bedfellows.
You're right. You're right. And when all else fails, as the saying goes, follow the money.
Follow the money.
Next two paragraphs says, nevertheless, his chance to campaign for political power came sooner than he had expected. When Teddy Roosevelt left the White House in 1909, the progressive movement in New York and across the nation was on the crest of a wave. An irresistible demand for reform was building up, and in 1910, local New York Democratic Party managers asked FDR to run for election to the state senate for rural Columbia, Dutchess, and Putnam counties. This was not surprising. Rich men, especially rich men with famous names, were often asked to run for hopelessly unwinnable seats like this, not least because they could pay for their own campaign. But this year was different. Not only did progressivism give Roosevelt the chance to campaign for the kind of clean government which would appeal to the conservative farmers of upstate New York, but also across the whole nation, it was a Democratic year, the first for nearly 2 decades. The Republicans, their national power intact since 1892, was now badly split over reform, the tariff, conservation, and much else. A little known 54-year-old university professor, president of Princeton, named Woodrow Wilson, who was running as progressive Democratic candidate for governor in the adjoining state of New Jersey, was expected to win. Since the founding of the Republican Party in the 1850s, only one Democrat had won the district Frank was now contesting. At this stage, Roosevelt was a bad public speaker. His grating, upper-class English-sounding accent often punctuated by long pauses. But he always loved campaigning and did so now with great gusto, touring the district in an open red motor car. This, plus the fact that some farmers may have thought a Roosevelt must be a Republican, plus heavy rain on polling day, which kept some die-hard opponents at home, plus the rising tide of political reform, all helped him run well ahead of the Democratic ticket and beat his Republican opponent by more than 1,000 votes. Now, I like the fact that it says here that at this time, in the early part of his political career, Roosevelt was a bad public speaker. And it's like, we heard the same thing about Churchill. We heard the same thing about Stalin, about Hitler, and Mussolini.
Yep.
Now, all five of these characters, bad public orator skills, but would later on be the head figures of one of the biggest human history of mankind.
Because all of these men were groomed for politics, so they found someone, cleaned up their image, improved their addiction, improved their speech, improved the way they dress. You know, people are groomed. They're groomed for the political spotlight. And people don't understand how much it's all image. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's smoke and mirrors to make you like them. So you vote for them. Not out of policy, because of emotion. Because you like them. As much as people love to argue, you know, that's why they're voting. That's why they're electing a candidate. Emotion, because they like them. They connect with them. They resonate with them. They make them feel good. Or make them feel wet in certain parts of the human anatomy, but I digress. It's all emotional.
I can't argue with that. There's too much evidence to deny it. Alrighty, so we'll wrap this up with the last paragraph. It says, in some respects, FDR's first political victory was the result of luck. The Roosevelt luck, which followed him most of his life. The important point, however, was that FDR always anticipated his luck with careful groundwork and capitalized on it afterwards. To see the truth of this, one need only compare him with Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Teddy's son. An amiable young man, bearer of the same famous name, he had ambition, brains, charm, and every opportunity to become his father's successor. After a spell as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he ran in 1924 for governor of New York when Republicans were riding high. But he was defeated and never heard of again. In this light, FDR's success depended on something more than mere chance. Whatever it was, the 1910 election meant that at this age of only 28, the world of political power was already at his feet. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the first chapter so far of the Houdini of the White House, FDR. And so far, despite coming from different backgrounds than some of the aforementioned figureheads we've talked about on the War Room so far, nevertheless, he shares similar traits as Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and even Churchill. And in fact, I find it interesting that last paragraph talk about the FDR luck. Even at that age, in his 20s, even Hitler believed that he had some sort of divine intervention, knowing that he would eventually go on to do bigger and greater things beyond himself. So it's funny how those two had a sheer belief in some sort of divine help.
Yeah, it's funny how that works, man. How they all have very similar. There were similarities in the upbringing. They didn't have the same upbringing, but there were definite similarities. And again, to hammer home that point that I said I'm going to hammer and hammer and hammer. Culture and mindset.
Mm-hmm.
They are inextricably linked. One creates the other creates the other. They self-perpetuate. So we see how a person's culture influences and develops their mindset, and how their minds and how collectively mindsets influence and create a culture. So if you want to change a culture or change yourself, you have to first change your mindset. A
Yep.
culture, you want to change your mindset, you have to change your culture. You want to change the culture, you have to change your mindsets. The link. Can't change one without the other.
Yep. Indeed. It all starts in the mind. To be, my personal belief is the greatest enemy of mankind is not something that is external. It is always something internal. Hence the saying, you are your own worst enemy.
Absolutely. Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, all battles are won and lost in the mind before they're ever fought. And to to go esoteric, what is the first of the seven hermetic principles? The law of mentalism.
Mm-hmm.
All is mental because mental is supreme.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
once again, culture and mindset. And with the proper mindset, you can actually achieve anything in life. You know, all barriers can be removed, all obstacles can be removed. At the end of the day, it starts and ends with you. But if you want to be a victim and you want to wave any kind of oppression card or blame others for your choices in life, that's on you. But when you get the results that you get in life, blame yourself, not external factors, because they can be mitigated. They can be removed. If you want extraordinary results, you have to develop an extraordinary mindset.
Indeed. Indeed. Definitely cannot say any better than that. So, with that said, my co host, Project Finance, so far with the information provided tonight on FDR and his upbringing, what would be your evaluation as far as the eventual 32nd president of the United States?
Once again, the takeaway has to be culture and mindset.
Hmm.
He came from money. He came from old money. He's what's called a blue blood.
Mm-hmm.
Old money. Established money, a lot of power, a lot of influence, a lot of control. However, he met his future wife, and she came from absolutely nothing, abject poverty. But her culture that she grew up in shaped her mindset, and it allowed FDR a window into another culture from a different perspective, and it allowed him to widen his worldview. So, culture and mindset, because it was Eleanor Roosevelt is the reason why the U.S. military is integrated. That was
Mm-hmm.
her. That was That was her baby. The Tuskegee Airmen, all Eleanor Roosevelt. So what I'm trying to say is the New Deal and everything that President Roosevelt did, I have to say, judging by this information here, he was affected by Eleanor Roosevelt, and her
Hmm.
mindset was shaped by her culture.
Yeah. And despite the fact that she too came from the Roosevelt line, her upbringing, especially reading the fact that her mother kept calling her ugly, her father essentially was another absentee type of father, it was pretty much her who decided that, you know, I'm going to really focus on bringing about integration and bringing about people from other cultures and mindsets into the American life. And so, if you really think about it, this is just my honest opinion, but you can actually thank Eleanor Roosevelt for the fact that a lot of the push today for men, women of all kind to be able to develop their own cultures and being able to develop families from different cultural aspects here in America, Eleanor Roosevelt helped to kind of do the legwork behind the name of FDR. It's interesting.
I have to say, that whole idea of a quote unquote gender war to me is absolute nonsense. It just
Yes.
absolutely reeks of such low and base thinking. But you know, again, it appeals to a certain mindset, a certain narrative, a certain way of thinking. But I just it's mind-boggling. A gender war. Come on, get out of here.
I agree. I agree. Again, it just highlights another aspect of elite practice classism. Everybody else practice all of the isms you could think of. And
There
so,
you go.
if you're so
Because
concerned, if you're so concerned about a gender war, you're not thinking like an elite.
you're not. You you're absolutely not. You're thinking like a sheep. You're being led around by the nose. Because if you just stop and take a second, what does that really mean? I mean, really, if you take that idea to its logical conclusion, are marriages stopping? Are births stopping? Is casual sex stopping? But yet there's a war going on. Okay, listen. If you honestly think that and believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. But again, it is easier to fool a man than it is to convince him he has in fact been fooled.
Indeed.
So, if you are comfortable in emotional thinking and following those narratives, by all means continue to do so. They will not serve you well, but they will make you feel comfortable.
Yeah. And
Elevating, elevating your thinking can be uncomfortable because it challenges you to examine everything that you hold as true. And people don't like to do that. Introspection is one of the hardest things that you can do in this human existence. That's why most people don't do
yep, I agree. Couldn't have said it better. And shout out to Morpheus in the chat. Good to see you, sir. But with that stated, that concludes part one of the early years of FDR. So next month we will get into part two and really see some of the more political influence of FDR and some of the things that will help shape his eventual seat into the White House. But already we can see that his upbringing, despite coming from a well to do family and old money, as Logic Finance pointed out, he definitely shared very similar traits to the likes of Churchill, Stalin, Mussolini, and even Hitler. And for those of you who don't know, just go back to our previous videos on those aforementioned men, and you will definitely see the clues of what we're talking about. So, definitely want to give thanks to the ladies and gentlemen who are listening on the live stream, and definitely thank you to those who will listen on the replay. And just to reiterate what my co-host talking about, culture matters. And that's something I definitely preach not only on this platform, but on the other platforms and private videos as well, that culture really does matter. And even in this historical aspect, in regards to these leaders, the eventual leaders of World War II, culture played a major role in how they saw life and how they want to influence the global realm of the culture they came up from.
I'd like to leave off with this because there are some people who are steadfastly and staunchly entrenched in the belief that if you don't have an alphabet behind your name, you don't know what you're talking about. So, you know what? Instead of watching people conduct 25-hour live streams and arguing with each other, go look up Jordan Peterson, an absolute brilliant man. Go listen to him speak. He has a PhD, has shred and destroy this whole idea of both feminism and of a quote unquote gender war. And he also goes on to speak how the importance of culture and mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So instead of following left wing or right wing and that binary thinking, elevate your thinking, challenge yourself, go sit down and listen to what actual thinkers like Jordan Peterson will have for you. And if you're really feeling brave, go listen to one Thomas Sowell. But again, I digress.
I don't think they're ready for the Thomas Sowell type of language in talking terms. That's going too deep down the rabbit hole for them. But hey, like like my co-host
That's what
says,
we do here.
yep, like my co-host says, if you feeling dangerous, definitely read up on his videos, him and Jordan Peterson. You will find yourself literally agreeing to what they hammer home with their arguments. And to be honest with you, to summarize their same talking points, and I just keep quoting it yet again, the elites practice classism. And the mere fact that only 2% of the American population, not just the globe, the number is smaller than that, but just on the American population, only 2% have an annual income that is six figures or above. Again, elites practice classism. Everybody else practice isms, or whatever type of isms you could think of.
Here's another number for you. 87% of America is 2 paychecks away from homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Let that sink in. Only 2% of Americans generate an income of at least $100,000. 2%. And in that number, you have to include athletes, entertainers, doctors, and lawyers. Only 1% of the population earn at least $250,000. And again, you have to include athletes, entertainers, doctors, and lawyers. America is a country of working poor with a low standard of living. You just can't see it because you're a bunch of monkeys living in a gilded cage.
Oh boy.
And that's not ethnic driven. That's to all American people. You're a bunch of monkeys living in a gilded cage. You just can't see it. You're like that episode of The Twilight Zone. You are the animals in the zoo. You just can't see it.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, with that stated then, I'm your host, Admiral Sigma Jones. This is my co-host, Logic's Finest. And we want to thank you all for watching The War Room. And until next time, this is indeed the War Room.
Auf Wiedersehen.